It's inevitable that many fantastic horror movies without massive marketing budgets end up slipping through the cracks, no matter if they've received rave reviews on the festival circuit. Even though horror fans tend to be an adventurous, eager bunch, keen to explore the genre's back catalogue and seek out hidden gems, it has to be said that they've failed to bring these 10 horror flicks to well-deserved prominence. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture here with 10 hidden horror movie gems nobody talks about. Number 10. Chained. It's truly bizarre that David Lynch's daughter, Jennifer Chambers Lynch, made a nasty, grimy little horror flick back in 2012, and yet barely anybody took any notice at all. Chained stars Vincent D'Onofrio as Bob, a ruthless serial killer who has kept one of his victims' sons, Rabbit, chained up as a prisoner in his home, with designs to train him to become a murderer just like him. It's a tantalising premise and one which Lynch engages with while pulling no punches, even if there's enough nuanced character development here to ensure that Chained never devolves into purely tacky exploitation schlock. Though it's not terribly surprising to anyone who's ever seen D'Onofrio act, the man knocks this deeply twisted role right out of the park. He's likewise impressively matched by the efforts of then newcomer Eamon Farron, whose portrayal of a broken young man on the brink feels as authentic as it does unsettling. Lean and mean in all the right ways, Chained proves that in terms of the Lynch family's filmmaking nous, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Number 9. Dead and Buried. One of the most underappreciated horror films of the entire 1980s, which is really saying something, Dead and Buried takes place in the coastal town of Potter's Bluff, where a violent mob begins murdering tourists, only for said tourist corpses to start coming back to life. Co-written by Alien screenwriter Dan O'Bannon, Dead and Buried is a much smarter movie than its seemingly stock concept might suggest, with director Gary Sherman initially focusing less on grisly gore, though there is plenty of that too, than the sheer eeriness of a town becoming overrun with something. From the terrific ensemble cast to the brilliant effects produced by the great Stan Winston, and a third act that pays everything off in inventive and wildly unexpected fashion, Dead and Buried is a diamond in the rough that desperately deserves reappraisal and rediscovery. If John Carpenter's The Fog is by far the more famous movie, Dead and Buried is a superior rendition of a superficially similar idea. Number 8. Starry Eyes. One of the most evocative looks at the dangerous pursuit of fame in recent times, Starry Eyes revolves around aspiring, struggling actress Sarah Walker, who enters into a diabolic bargain in her pursuit of fame and sees her life change forever, for better or worse. If the filmmakers aren't exactly subtle in their critique of Hollywood's predatory and hyper-competitive nature, their approach compensates with both its brutal honesty and, well, its straight-up brutality. Without giving too much away, this is a film packed with visceral, revolting sights. Yet none of these moments would hit nearly as hard were it not for the sublime lead performance from Alex Esso, who between this and her subsequent work on several Mike Flanagan productions, deserves to be a much bigger name in the genre than she currently is. Starry Eyes' blunt critique of an exploitative industry and uncompromising gnarliness won't work for everyone, but even so, Esso's outstanding work makes it a must-see for adventurous viewers. Number 7. Cure. Despite being one of the most acclaimed horror films of the 1990s, it's truly shocking how even die-hard genre fans don't talk much about psychological horror masterpiece Cure. This film follows a Tokyo detective investigating a series of violent killings in the city committed seemingly at pure random. And while that premise might suggest card-carrying supernatural shenanigans, Cure is far more interested in rendering its tantalizing premise in as gritty and grounded terms as possible. More in the vein of David Fincher's Seven than, say, The Ring, this is a sublimely controlled, restrained piece of work, which places more of an emphasis on gut-wrenching atmosphere and unravelling an intoxicatingly strange mystery than jump scares or gore. Though more mainstream skewing J-horror hits like Ring, Audition and Ju-on The Grudge followed in its wake, Cure's ice-cold filmmaking and expectation-defying narrative make it a far superior beast and one of the most unforgettable horror films you've probably never heard of. Number 6. Nina Forever. Here's a horror flick that just came and went in a flash in 2015 despite scoring rave reviews from most critics. Brit horror comedy Nina Forever follows Rob, who, after the death of his girlfriend Nina in a car crash, unsuccessfully attempts suicide. In an effort to get his life back together and move on, however, he then starts dating co-worker Holly. All's well and good, except that whenever the pair have sex, the bloody visage of Nina interrupts and torments them, seemingly anything but content in the afterlife. It's a fiercely original concept for a film, and one explored with intelligence, heart, and stinging humour by filmmakers Ben and Chris Blaine, while the performances of the three leads are first-rate. Managing to be sexy, effed up, funny, and even unexpectedly affecting all at once, this is one of the most confident horror filmmaking debuts of the last decade, yet sadly hasn't ever gotten its due from the masses. Number 5. Pontypool. 2008's Pontypool is one of the most uniquely, ingeniously premised horror films ever, centred around a deadly virus spreading throughout a small Ontario town. If that logline sounds familiar, the kicker is that the virus spreads through the English language, forcing shock jock protagonist Grant and his fellow survivors to find increasingly creative ways to communicate with each other. Terrifically acted by the great Stephen McHattie, while proving the merits of a brilliant idea no matter the budget, Pontypool is an uncommonly gripping lo-fi horror that finds a totally original niche through which to depict a viral outbreak. Though director Bruce McDonald finally released a spin-off, Dreamland, in 2019, a direct sequel called Pontypool Changes has been in development ever since the original's release, yet sadly still hasn't come to pass. Number 4. The Wolf of Snow Hollow. The werewolf movie is another horror subgenre that feels thoroughly played out, so props to filmmaker Jim Cummings for breathing fresh life into it with this dryly funny and unexpectedly heartfelt entry. Cummings stars as a downtrodden deputy sheriff investigating a series of grisly murders in his small mountain town, which have occurred after each full moon. Much as you might think you know exactly where this familiar setup is going, Cummings' film is a deliciously subversive take on the werewolf flick, with some terrifically smart twists and turns lying in wait. Nimbly walking on a tonal tightrope between outright horror and quirky comedy, this feels nothing like any other werewolf picture, while bolstered by the efforts of an immaculate ensemble cast led by Cummings and the late great Robert Forster, whose role here was sadly his final. You've seen a ton of similarly premised movies, but never one with execution quite like this. Number 3. Afflicted. It's so incredibly difficult to do anything new or innovative in the found footage space, so it's a damn shame that Derek Lee and Cliff Prowse's stunning 2013 entry Afflicted hasn't had more love over the last decade. The film follows two best pals, Derek and Cliff, as they travel the world and record a web series. But while in Barcelona, Derek becomes infected with a virus which causes him to manifest vampiric traits. Besides how surprisingly few vampire-centric found-footage movies there are, what sets Afflicted apart from other genre efforts is its jaw-dropping technical finesse. Lee and Prowse clearly put a ton of work into delivering a found-footage film that's not just full of shaky camera work and played-out parlor tricks. Some of the camera movements in this movie, such as one point having Lee take a perilous leap from a window to the ground, have a genuine how the hell did they do that quality, given the film's mere $300,000 budget. Between this and the genuine chemistry between the star filmmakers, Afflicted remains an uncommonly smart and visceral stab at an overcrowded genre, and a maddeningly overlooked one. Number 2. The Greasy Strangler. For a moment in time in 2016, it seemed like Jim Hosking's black comedy horror The Greasy Strangler was going to become a genuine cult genre film phenomenon, but it ultimately didn't quite take. Still, those who know. If you're ever in the market for a horror film that'll make you want to take a shower immediately after watching, if not during, look no further than The Greasy Strangler, which certainly lives up to and beyond its enticing title in the ick stakes. To call it a mere film about a man, Big Ronnie, who greases himself up and throttles unsuspecting locals in his spare time, is rather underselling just how profoundly weird and revolting this movie is. The disturbing relationship between Ronnie and his son Big Braden forms much of its focus, in turn presenting a duo of lead characters whose company you'll be so glad to escape by film's end. But don't mistake that as backhanded praise. The Greasy Strangler's uniquely weird, indeed horrifying tone and dryly unhinged sense of humour make it one of the most memorable horrors of the last 10 years. Number 1. Sleep Tight. Now, to be clear from the outset, sickos need only apply to Sleep Tight, a deeply disturbing horror thriller about a downtrodden concierge of a Barcelona apartment building who decides to mess with the building's tenants and in particular Clara, a young woman he's fixated on. Sleep Tight is a film that categorically pulls no punches with the grim eventuality of its premise, such that those of a queasy disposition might want to steer well clear. For everyone else, though, this is a tightly wound slice of Hitchcock on bath salts that manages to render an inherently outlandish concept terrifyingly believable, in large part due to the outstanding lead performance of the increasingly twisted villain. Despite receiving near-universal acclaim on the festival circuit back in 2011, Sleep Tight quickly faded into obscurity and is rarely discussed among genre aficionados these days. That desperately needs to change.